emotional support community. I am so excited for today's video. We are joined by Dr. Lindsay Tulchin, who is a psychologist who specializes in all things CBT. Hello.
Hi, Allison. How are you?
I'm good. Big reveal. Lindsay is also one of my sister's best friends from middle school, or was it
No,
high
I didn't
school?
go to middle school, high school.
High
I came
school.
in ninth grade and Jocelyn was my first friend. So
Can you describe what CBT is? Because I think it's a term that's thrown out a lot, but maybe people don't
yes.
know the specifics.
Yes. So the thing with CBT is we like to have a lot of like hyphenated descriptions of what it is. So like evidence-based, short-term, change-oriented, present-focused type of therapy. We focus on the connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Really, that's sort of like the overarching theory.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be applied to specific problems: OCD, panic disorder, social anxiety, generalized anxiety, depression, you name it. And it could also be used more generally for just like general life problems, interpersonal conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's sometimes a little bit of a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of CBT being very protocol oriented, like it's kind of robotic, which it's really not. I mean, obviously there are manuals that are very evidence-based, like they've been sort of through the rigor of a real science, like research experiments and have been proven effective. And so it's important to understand that there are specific things that should be adhered to, but there's also a flexibility that can be applied when it's not so cut and dry, which no one is when they come through the door.
Right.
So that's sort of like the little elevator pitch. And we can go into more details about how it's applied, if that makes sense, if we want to get into that conversation too.
Yeah, like what does it look like if someone comes through your door and is like, I'm struggling with intrusive thoughts, for instance? Like, how would you sort of attack that?
So intrusive thoughts suggesting OCD type of behaviors. So if someone is diagnosed with OCD, then there is a very specific type of technique that's applied called exposure and response prevention. I'm sure you're well aware. And it's basically what we do is the intrusive thought is generally surrounding some trigger. So we could do contamination, we can go elsewhere.
Let's go personal. Let's do contamination.
All right. So with contamination OCD, which is a very common type of OCD, there is a fear that when touching something that's considered dirty, I named it, is it sick or ick, right? So either people feel like they're going to get sick from that thing, or they just feel really, really dirty and it feels like an ick. And that feeling creates a ton of anxiety in your body. And so what do you do to manage the anxiety? Well, you avoid the thing that's considered dirty, and you really try to reduce contamination by engaging in all of these really creative ways to minimize the dirtiness from spreading or from coming to you. But what's really happening is there's this anxiety and avoidance pattern that gets reinforced over time. So let's take the New York City subways as an example, because that's my favorite one.
Yeah.
And we have a lot, like, for example, if someone has contamination OCD, the subways are really challenging because they're the subways. Right. So there might be a bit of holding onto the pole with a paper towel to avoid having anything come in contact with your hand, or really doing like surfing where you're not touching anything.
That's what I do.
Yeah, so that's probably the most effective for you, because then you don't have to, but then I think there's still this feeling of the air is dirty, right? So then you get home, and what would someone do? Like shower immediately, take off your clothes, outdoor clothes or indoor clothes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like not allowing anyone else to sit on your bed or on your couch if they've come from the subway, right? So there's a lot of techniques that you do in order to prevent the anxiety from the quote unquote contamination. Right. But does it reduce your anxiety? Really? No. because the next time you're in that situation, you're feeling just as anxious as you did the time before. And the truth is, you can't control the environment so that you really don't experience any of the anxiety. So the way that CBT approaches this is through exposure and response prevention. Exposure to the trigger being the dirtiness, the contamination, and then really sitting with that discomfort that it brings up long enough for your body to learn. And it really is an experiential learning that this is actually just uncomfortable. This is not dangerous. And most importantly, I can tolerate it, and it will go away by itself. Right. So one of the things that a lot of people feel about that anxious feeling is, this is dangerous, that there's something about this is dangerous, that it's going to stay like this forever, that it won't go away, and then I can't tolerate it.
Right.
So what CBT really teaches is, it's not dangerous, it's just uncomfortable. It's not going to stay forever, it's just temporary, and you can tolerate it. It's just a matter of practicing. So through continued exposures, and we would do it gradually, right? We're not going to throw you into the worst case scenario right away, although probably would be more effective to do that. But we really take it, I set the pace with my clients. And so it's whatever you feel comfortable with. Some people come in and they say, like, I'm ready, I want to jump in, or I can tell that they're just really, really nervous and don't want to do anything. So we'll start small. And once you gain mastery over each rung of the ladder, you work your way up to something that feels harder and harder and harder. So that's something specific to contamination OCD. OCD looks very different. In some people have just sort of like the pure obsessional type of OCD, where you're sort of like thinking about something and then can't get that out of your head. And, I'm not going to get into the details of it here because it's very nuanced, but we would attack that in a similar way. And so that's what it would look like for something like that. And, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify unhelpful thinking patterns, right? So is this subway pole really going to get me sick? Well, now, maybe. No.
But I think I've never heard someone describe it like either sick or ick. And I have just ick, where I'm never afraid of getting sick. I'm just purely afraid of feeling contaminated.
I know. Yeah. So, right. Because I think if people approach it like, well, what are you really worried about? You're not going to get sick. You're missing the point, because that for you, it's, yes, I know I'm not going to get sick. Right. But there's that feeling that we need to help you learn to tolerate and habituate to. And that's what exposure does.
And can you talk a little bit about like when it is just pure O, which is just kind of like all in your thoughts, like how would you do an exposure with something like that?
So nothing is really ever pure O. That's just what we call it. And really what's probably happening is the compulsion is actually mental also. Okay. So there might be like a neutralizing thought, for example, like, what if I accidentally stab myself with this knife that I'm holding, right? Which is, that's a common OCD thought. And something that's pure O might be like, oh no, but you would never do that. Which in reality works great if you're not stuck in the cycle. But when you're stuck in the cycle, then the intrusive thought becomes, well, what if you do this time?
Right.
Right.
Like just ruminating on it.
Just a loop. So what we would do then is something called an imaginal exposure, where it's the same thing. Instead of touching the subway pole, you say, maybe I'm going to stab myself with a knife. Maybe I'm going to stab myself with a knife. Maybe I'm going to. So you're really, the exposure is to the thought itself, because the thought itself is what's bringing about the anxiety.
And so
it sounds crazy. People are like, you're saying what? But it works.
But it works. And I mean, it's also a lot of like, this exposure element is so crucial to so many different disorders, I feel like, with like PTSD and, social anxiety. And even just, I like dislocated my knee on my way back to LA, and it was disgusting. And at first I couldn't even let myself think about it, because it was so, it became like kind of a medical trauma. But I've tried to now like let myself think about that moment just to expose myself to it, because there is the fear that it might dislocate again. And so I have to get myself in a place where like, that's not the scariest thing that could possibly happen to me.
So is the thing that feels scary, like the image of it being dislocated?
Yeah. And like the pain and the just, yeah, but also just like the grossness of it move, you know, like all of it is just so, I had such a visceral response. I think first week or two after the injury happened that I realized like, okay, I need to sort of get to a place where I can think about this without it like making me so uncomfortable. Applies.
You might want to consider looking at some pictures of dislocated knees once you feel like you're ready.
I don't know if I need to go that far. But I also feel like CBT can help a lot of like how you think about yourself and how you think about.
Yes. So I'm talking about a very exposure focused type of CBT, which is not always how it goes, right? If someone's coming in with more just like general problems or some anxiety, but it's not like a specific type of anxiety, then we do a lot of what's called cognitive restructuring, which is when you identify unhelpful thinking patterns that we call cognitive distortions or thinking errors or thinking traps or whatever you want to call it. It's just like the errors that we make when interpreting things, because we're human and not robots. And we really work to help that person identify when those errors are occurring and then correcting that type of thinking. So for example, a friend might not respond to a text message. Really common occurrence, right? So someone's feeling really bad about that because maybe they think, oh, they're mad at me. Or, ugh, maybe they just don't really like me. They don't want to hang out with me. So that's a really common reaction to something like that. Now, could it be possible that your friend doesn't like you and is mad at you? Sure. But aren't there a million other reasons why they also might not be texting you? And that would probably make you feel a little bit better in the moment. Yes. So that is a cognitive distortion that we call personalization. And personalization happens quite often. It's one of our favorites. And because, we can only think in terms of us, we can't think in terms of someone else. We have a lot of mind reading also. So like thinking that what someone else is thinking. So identifying something like mind reading, personalization. And then what we do after we identify it is then you come up with, well, what is a more helpful way of looking at the situation? And one way to do that is say, well, is there another alternative explanation to why someone might not respond to a text message? What about you? Why don't you respond to text message sometimes? Well, I'm busy. I didn't look at my phone. I just didn't have the energy at the moment. I was a little annoyed at the person and I wanted to, I wasn't, right? So now that you're coming up with alternative explanations, it doesn't necessarily mean that the first one isn't correct, but it's automatically shrinking the percentile in which you can believe it, because now you're adding more to the mix and you can only believe something 100%. So if you now have 4 options, you can't believe something 100% anymore.
And is there also an element of getting used to the idea, if this person is mad at me, I will be okay? That's not the end of the world?
Well, so we call that catastrophizing, right? Yes. If someone is mad at you, then what? Well, I guess we could work through it. I guess I could apologize if I did something wrong. Oh, okay. And what would that be like? Well, it would be uncomfortable, but it would probably be okay, right? So a lot of times we stop at like, oh God, like that's the end, right? That's the end of the thing. But really we have to work through what it would look like in its entirety. Can you tolerate that? Yes, I can tolerate it. It won't be comfortable. It will be challenging, but I can tolerate it. And so a lot of a really important kind of seemingly obvious thing or like a coping statement that someone might identify is like, that will be hard, but I can do hard things, right? Because there's a lot of overestimation of the chance of something going wrong and the underestimation of your ability to cope with it if it does.
Yeah. I think, one of my new mantras is like, I'll be able to handle it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what is coming and I don't, but I know that like, I can trust that whatever it is, I'll be able to handle it. I won't necessarily enjoy it. And I don't necessarily like need to go through that, but if I have to, I'll be able to handle it. And that's very freeing in a lot of ways.
Totally. And a lot of people you'll see, you know, for like worriers, what worry is doing is it's, you know, attempting to solve problems before they occur. So you're anticipating all of these future problems and then basically thinking about how am I going to solve that problem? But it doesn't feel helpful because you're not actually being proactive in solving a problem because there is no problem yet.
Right.
Right. So there's obviously a very protective, and there is a reason our bodies our brains are really like primed to look for danger. And so we can find it if we look for it. And so one of the things that I really try to instill in people who tend to worry about future oriented problems that don't exist yet is let's focus on your confidence in your ability to problem solve. Let's look at the evidence from the past. Like when a problem has actually come up, how have you dealt with it? Has there ever been a time where you just didn't deal with it? No, you've always figured something out, even if it was hard, even if you had to ask for help, right? You can always figure it. So it's really giving someone confidence in their ability to problem solve rather than trying to problem solve a problem that doesn't exist yet.
And having some trust in your future self.
Yes.
You know, like I don't need to do this. If it happens, future Allison will take care of it.
Exactly. Yeah. Because look at what past Allison has done so far.
Exactly. And what are some other like really common distortions, like the text message thing that you see a lot coming up?
I think it's sort of along the lines of not being able to cope if things go wrong, right? So, or really, there's another big one is jumping to conclusions. So, something like, I'm going to get fired, right? Like something happens at work and my boss wants to talk to me later. I'm going to get fired. Right. So there's this, we have a really hard time, a lot of us, sitting in the gray, sitting in the uncertainty. So that can really manifest itself in so many different ways. So oftentimes we don't know how things are going to turn out, but what our brains like to do is because we don't like to sit in the gray, we jump to a conclusion just so we can find a solution, like find a conclusion, but really that conclusion is generally not positive. I mean, very few people are like, yeah, and I figured I'd get a promotion from this. Right? Like usually it's, oh God, what happened? Like something's wrong.
Right.
So really teaching people and building up their confidence in their ability to sit with the unknown and tolerate that gray area of like, well, I might not be getting fired or probably not getting fired. They might be, maybe they're upset with my performance on this one thing.
Yeah.
Like how can I deal with that? Right. So jumping to conclusions, fortune telling, those are the cognitive distortions that we'd identify there. And then there's also that element of catastrophizing also, where you take a future, maybe something that is negative and make it into this thing that where you can't cope or you can't tolerate it if it happens.
And I know, like you mentioned at the beginning, that CBT is very present focused, but do you do elements of like talk therapy with your clients as well? To sort of get to the root of why these distortions are happening, or is that not really necessary?
It's definitely a main part of CBT when it makes sense to be. So one of the things that I think also is like a misconception of CBT is that that it's not like therapy, right? Like that it's separate from, I mean, it is separate from talk therapy if you just think of talk therapy as supportive therapy, in that CBT is more goal-oriented and a little bit more skills-based, but we don't ignore life and we don't ignore history. So often we'll sort of, once I'm working with a patient for a significant amount of time, we'll start to see patterns that emerge. And what the patterns are really telling us, okay, so you're thinking this about this thing, but it keeps coming back to this one core belief about yourself or about the world. How did that core belief come about? Let's look back. Let's look at your childhood. Let's look at the messages that you were getting from your parents. Let's look at the modeling that was there. So it's really helpful to understand where it came from, but it's the difference between CBT and more psychodynamic treatment is psychodynamic is more insight oriented, and you do spend a lot of time in the dynamics of your childhood to really get a real understanding of why I am the way I am. And in CBT, we go back to come forward again, to bring it back to the present and say like, okay, here's why I think the way I think. That doesn't actually serve me anymore. Maybe it did serve me then, but it doesn't serve me anymore. Here's how I can work to change it.
And I feel like so many people would benefit from this, but don't have the means or the access to therapy, is because of how like there are workbooks and it is so in a way scientific. Is this something someone can learn to like implement on their own?
So I would say yes and no. I would say there are the main tenets of CBT that you can learn that are more didactic. There are coping skills, techniques, exercises like relaxation, diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, even mindfulness meditation, which is actually a big part of CBT. Those can all be learned and taught, I think. And there are workbooks that I can tell you that I really trust in terms of their ability to relay the meat and potatoes of what we would do in sessions. The only hesitation I have is if someone is really severely ingrained in something, it really helps having someone explain the nuances behind it, because there are a lot of nuances, especially in something like OCD, where if you go to someone who's not well versed in what OCD cycle is and doesn't necessarily know CBT, then you might actually end up engaging in behaviors that worsen the cycle. For example, like reassurance seeking, right? So reassurance seeking we see a lot in OCD, and it momentarily does relieve the anxiety, but we know that it just exacerbates the problem long term. And so if a therapist or a person who's reading a book might not get that point, then you might still be engaging in the reassurance seeking that won't actually help solve the problem. But there are a series of workbooks. They're called the Treatments That Work workbooks, and they actually have so many specific targeted treatments that they work on. They have social anxiety, panic disorder, like I feel like there's one for like not doing your homework. Like they're very specific. Depression, PTSD, although I would really encourage people to work with someone if dealing with trauma. But I really do trust that workbook series, and it's something that I actually recommend to my patients, and we do it together. We do it, that's their homework. Oh, so one thing I did not mention about CBT is there's homework.
Right.
So it's not, and the reason why it is really effective, if there is a lot of motivation on the client's part, is that you're practicing during the week what you discuss in therapy, so that you can really build on those skills. And that's where the real change happens. If you're just meeting once a week and not thinking about what we talked about, you're not going to see a ton of movement. It might take a lot longer. Right. So there is a more collaborative sort of, practice oriented approach to it also. So going back to the books, so the Treatments That Work series is great. There's also a book or workbook called Mind Over Mood that I found to be particularly helpful. And my number one OCD book that I recommend to everyone is called Freedom from OCD. And it's by Jonathan Grayson. And it's probably the most well-written, easy to understand. And it has the most different kinds of examples of OCD, because a lot of it's so nuanced that people are like, okay, but like, I don't have that kind of OCD. I don't have that. This one has a lot of different types of OCD. So those are my go-tos. That's
great. And in terms of like short-term therapy, I think because therapy is a big financial commitment.
Yes.
If you've never done CBT before, would it make sense for someone to maybe just be like, I'm going to see a therapist for six times and then take what I learn and then move on? Like, would that be a helpful thing for people to know, that they can really do like a short-term like intro with the therapist if they can't afford long-term therapy?
So I'm hesitant to say 6 sessions is enough for everyone.
Right.
It can definitely be enough for some. But it's certainly, it's oriented to be, we work on this problem, we fix the problem, and then you don't need me anymore.
Right.
And so it's not this sort of like ongoing, open-ended,
The rest of
although
your life.
there's no hard end date, but it's, the goal is to get you out the door, right?
Mhm.
So I say to my patients, I love you, I like you, I want to keep working with you, but I'm going to say goodbye because
Yeah.
you don't need me anymore. And it's like, we're talking about your dog's thing. And like, this isn't, you don't need me. This is great. This is a good sign. You can come back if you need me at any point. My door's always open, but best wishes, right? Like that's the goal. And I think people are very appreciative of that because it feels like, okay, now you have confidence in me to do this on my own. And and what really ends up happening is you start weekly and then you work to every other week. Then you maybe do monthly and then
Booster sessions here and
booster
there,
sessions
maybe.
as needed.
Yeah.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, I think if 6 is better than 0, what I would say, but it might not be all.
Yeah, I guess I just threw that out there because I think there's like 6 not being like the right number, but
Right,
just the
right,
sense
right,
of like,
yeah, you
there's a
can learn a
potential
lot.
you could save the money for a
Yes,
certain amount of things, what you're capable of doing without feeling like, oh, I'm adding this expense that I can't sustain for,
right,
X amount of years.
right.
Um, and
Yeah,
then
so
how long do your clients tend to see? Is there like around a certain area?
well, it's hard because this year was sort of an anomaly year. Like
Yeah.
nobody wanted to leave, which I'm glad. Well, I wouldn't either. Because we were, things were just so uncertain. And so it was really an important time for therapy. But I would say like 6 months, a year. But,
Yeah.
again, like people are coming with one goal and then obviously we find more things to
Right.
work on, right? So, but, I have had people that have come for 10 sessions and we've solved a problem and they're done.
Yeah. I just think that's a big misconception about therapy and
Yeah.
medication that like it's
Yeah.
lifelong, but it doesn't.
No,
It doesn't have to be, and a lot of times it shouldn't be.
no, I agree. It's really, obviously it's helpful during a time for something specific. And then the goal is to give you the skills and tools to be able to do it for yourself. And my favorite thing is when people come in and they say, I heard your voice saying, okay, well, what's another way to look at this? What's a different perspective we can take? And I'm like, yes, great, it's working, good. If people walk around hearing my voice, that's great.
And now I've heard some people be like, CBT did not work for me, that it like actually was like triggering or harmful. And have you sort of had that experience with clients? Why do you have an idea of why it wouldn't work for some people?
Well, I think it depends on the therapist. A lot of it depends on the therapist. There are a lot of people that say that they do CBT without actually being trained in CBT and really specialize in it. And I think that can be a problem when it's not done correctly. It could have been that maybe that person was just really not motivated to put in the work, or it just felt like that therapist didn't align with them in terms of how much they were willing to in the moment. Like maybe it was just a mismatch. And there are other like particular goals that someone might want that don't really align with what CBT is sort of after in terms of change. And maybe that person really does just want to understand a little bit more and doesn't want to do some like to have such specific more, I don't want to call it superficial because it's really not superficial. It is more like top layer stuff, and then you can work down as opposed to starting from inside and working out. And then there are just some people that are a little bit more complicated, and that's okay. And maybe they just need to find either a better fit with therapists, which by the way is what really is the most important factor, is therapist client match. Because if that's not there, then nothing else will work.
Right. Now that's so interesting, learning in school that like it's been proven that the number one thing that matters over theoretical orientation, over everything, is just like the client therapist relationship.
Yes. So that really could be a big reason why it didn't work.
Yeah.
Especially if that person only tried it with one therapist.
And then could we just talk a little bit about that connection between thoughts, feelings, behavior, and how that, like your opinion on that and how it drives kind of everything that we do?
Sure. Okay, so if you think of it kind of in this like tri-directional triangle, we have thoughts, emotions, behaviors. And you're going to imagine like little arrows on each of those, meaning they're all sort of affecting one another. And an example that I like to usually give is, let's say you're walking down the street and someone brushes into your arm. Not you, a person. That person might feel angry. They might be like, like, what a jerk, right? Like, how dare he? Did he just not see me? Like, how dare he walk and hit me in the arm and not turn around and apologize? And then that person might carry that anger and then walk into the coffee shop and like not hold the door for the next person, and or like have a really like sort of icky exchange with a coworker because they're just sort of holding on to that anger, and it's really going to affect their mood for the rest of the day. Another person, same exact situation happens, person brushes into their shoulder and they think, oh, I guess he didn't see me.
Right.
And they think nothing of it, and they're feeling completely neutral, and they go about their day how they would have before. So the only difference in those two scenarios is the interpretation of the intention of that other person when hitting, right? When hitting their shoulder. One person thought it was purposeful and sort of rude, and the other person was like giving them the benefit of the doubt that they just didn't see them. So that is a really obvious way in which your thought affects your emotion, which affects your behavior.
Right.
And it's as simple as that, and it gets 100 times more complicated. But we simultaneously, if you are acting in a way that, you know, so you're maybe your arms are crossed and your brow is furrowed and your sort of muscles are tense, your body is getting the signal that you're angry. And so it's going to produce more angry interpretations of outside situations. There have actually been a lot of studies that show if you smile, when you're smiling, that like there are certain muscles that send signals to your brain that are signaling, oh, we're smiling, I guess we're happy. and then you actually feel the emotion of being happy. So there's so many connections that we're just not aware of. Right. And so part of what CBT is helping identify, what are those helpful ways of thinking? What are those unhelpful ways of thinking? What are the helpful behaviors and what are the unhelpful behaviors? Another really good example is with someone who's depressed, they're feeling really down and they're feeling really low. So what do? They lay in bed all day. They put the curtains drawn and they don't talk to anyone. And they're feeling isolated and they're feeling low energy and demotivated. And part of that is a symptom of the depression. And at the same time, it's a side effect of the behavior. So in order to treat some like depression, what we do first is something called behavioral activation, where we're just saying, okay, we need to change your behaviors first. Then we can start to free up the thinking, because the thinking is so intertwined right now with how you can't think to yourself, oh, today's going to be an okay day, or maybe I can get X done today if you're lying in bed with the curtains drawn, not talking to anyone. Right. So doing things, getting out and like making a plan, a daily plan, getting into the shower, calling a friend, something very simple, just to get the ball rolling so that we can then help that person feel better. And you might not even be tackling the thoughts right now. You might just be focusing on the behaviors. So there's a lot of interconnectedness.
But it feels I think that's a hopeful thing of like, yeah, I've been unable to change my thoughts, but I can maybe make myself take a shower, which will then later help me change my thoughts, you know, that it doesn't just, you can come at it from any of the three corners.
Yes. And there are specific problems where it makes more sense to intervene from a behavioral level, like with exposures.
Right.
And there's another, and some other times it might make sense to intervene with a cognitive perspective, like restructuring or, you know, learning how to have coping statements or that kind of thing.
This has been so unbelievably helpful. I guess just before I let you go, like, do you have any just sort of like overall advice as people like are re-entering society and are maybe going to, be dealing with some triggers that they haven't had to deal with for the last year while they've been at home?
Yeah. So trust in your ability to habituate.
Mm.
When COVID first hit, we were like, what in the, like, what's going on? We didn't think that we'd ever be able to deal with quarantine. And like, it sucked, but we managed, we habituated. And then it actually started to feel kind of okay. And now it's our safe place is maybe back in our house because we don't want to be out. And so going back into society, it's the same idea. You did it once, you can do it again. It's all about habituation. Habituation is just staying in the moment long enough for your body to recognize, I can do this, this is okay. It won't feel this hard the next time I do it. So that's one thing, is this trust in your ability to habituate. And the other piece of it, the other sort of like major CBT advice is when you're anxious about something, it's usually in anticipation. And 9 out of 10 times that thing that you're worried about is not as bad as you thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Right. So just remembering that, and it can actually be kind of fun. So anticipate that it will be hard, manage expectations that you actually might not enjoy it the first few times, like going back into work, into the office. It might not feel great. You might feel great one moment and then another moment feel like this is too much.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say do it gradually, trust in your ability to habituate, and manage expectations that it might not be fun right away.
That's great. I needed to hear that.